In this episode, we will continue with Billy realizing that Wallace was not either able or willing to honor his agreement with him to pardon him for his past crimes in exchange for his testimony, resulting in he and Folliard walking out of the jail in Lincoln and riding for Fort Sumner. Like my previous episodes, I will be reading directly from the transcripts of Robert's tape-recorded interviews with William V. Morrison. The interviews used in this episode were recorded between June and August 1949 at Hamilton and Hyco, Texas, and Lincoln and Carrizozo, New Mexico. Portions of these interviews were previously published in the following books: Alias Billy the Kid by William V. Morrison and C.L. Sonnichsen, The Return of the Outlaw Billy the Kid by W.C. Jameson and Frederick Bean, The Real Billy the Kid, a.k.a. Brushy Bill Roberts, by Brett Hall, Billy the Kid, The Lost Interviews by W.C. Jameson, and Billy the Kid Beyond the Grave, also by W.C. Jameson. Once again, I will also be comparing Robert's version of events with those depicted in the book The Saga of Billy the Kid by Walter Noble Burns, to show that they are completely dissimilar from one another and that the claim made by neo-historians that Roberts obtained his knowledge of Billy the Kid's life by memorizing the Burns book is completely unfounded and not based on facts. With that said, let's examine Robert's statements and see if they can be verified by sources. Quote, "They never arrested anyone else for the Brady murder. They never tried to arrest anyone else. They didn't do like they promised me. They pinned the whole affair on me because they wanted to get rid of Billy the Kid. But they didn't hang me, they didn't. It was around this time I shot and killed that bounty hunter, Joe Grant, in that saloon in Fort Sumner. He bragged that he was going to kill me, but he was the one that got killed. He was a drunk and pulled his gun. I was forced to defend myself." End quote. In the Saga of Billy the Kid, Burns describes Joe Grant as being from Texas, quote, "posed as a bad man and pretending to join the Kid's gang." End quote. Burns then has Grant drinking inside Jose Valdez's saloon when Billy and some of his friends enter, when Grant immediately challenges the Kid to a bet, stating, "I'll bet you I kill a man today before you do." Billy attempts to laugh off Grant's challenge. When Grant says, "If you think I don't mean it, I'll bet you $25 and put up the cash." Grant then hands Jose Valdez the money, and Billy then matches Grant and hands Valdez $25 as well. Burns then has Billy leave and returns to the saloon later on that evening, arriving with some cowboys who worked for Chisholm, completely forgetting about the bet he made with Grant earlier in the day until being secretly reminded by Valdez and cautioned to be on guard. Billy then walks up to Grant, acting friendly and complimenting Grant's ivory-handled revolver, asking if he might take a look at it. Grant obliged, and while examining the gun, he noticed 2 empty cartridges, and that he revolved the cylinder so that in the first 2 attempts to fire it, the hammer would fall on the empty shells. A short time and a few drinks later, Burns has Grant make his move, edging around the corner of the bar, facing the Kid, pulling his revolver, saying, "I'll win my bet with you right now," before attempting to fire his weapon point blank at Billy's face, the hammer clicking harmlessly. Billy then shoots Grant in the throat, cutting his windpipe and shattering his backbone, resulting in his death. Billy then cracks, "That's a good joke on Grant, and as I win the bet, Valdez, you might as well pass over that $50. End quote. According to most written accounts, on January 10, 1880, Billy the Kid was talking with James Chisholm inside Bob Hargrove's saloon in Fort Sumner when he encountered Joe Grant, a drunken hardcase who had been loudly proclaiming his intent on killing the Kid for the bounty. Apparently, Grant first threatened James Chisholm, believing him to be his brother John Chisholm. Then he threatened the Kid, not knowing who he was. Grant then proceeded to exhibit his shooting talents by shooting several bottles on the back bar. Billy was reportedly anxious to avoid trouble and attempted to join him. "Let me help break up housekeeping, pard," he said. Grant, however, became annoyed and threw his gun down on Billy and pulled the trigger. The gun failed to fire. The Kid calmly withdrew his sidearm and shot Grant in the head. In the book Inventing Billy the Kid by Stephen Tatum, he states, quote, "Contrary to the legend, the Kid, as Maurice G. Fulton concludes, did not borrow the drunken Grant's 6-shooter and turn its cylinder so that the next round would be on an empty chamber. Rather, if the incident happened at all, Grant's revolver, as was frequently the case with frontier firearms, failed to fire at the critical moment when he had the drop on the kid." End quote. According to Frederick Nolan, in the Lincoln County War, a documentary history, quote, "As for Grant, the kid's only recorded comment on the fracas was made to Milner Rudolph, postmaster at Sunnyside near Fort Sumner. Talking to Charlie Beaudry, Rudolph learned that another man had turned up his toes at Sumner. As the February 22, 1881 edition of the Las Vegas Daily Optic reported it, upon being asked who it was, he, Beaudry, said the man's name was Joe Grant. Rudolph asked Billy what occasioned the trouble, and he remarked, 'Oh, nothing, it was a game of two, and I got there first.'" End quote. In the September 1937 issue of Personal Adventure Stories, A.P. Anaya, who was a personal friend of the kid's, declared that the kid killed Grant because Chisholm had sent him to kill the kid. He also claims to have witnessed Billy pulling a gun on Chisholm and forcing him to pay him the money he owed. This confirms Robert's statement from my previous video, that following the death of McSween, he confronted Chisholm about the money he was owed, stating, quote, "I tried to get him to pay us. I told him the quickest way he could do it was too slow. I had my 6-shooter in his ribs, and I don't know why I didn't put him in a 6-foot grave. From then on, old John was our bitterest enemy." End quote. This is another win for Roberts, as this incident is often overlooked by many Billy the Kid and Lincoln County War historians. Yet Roberts' account was verified by a credible eyewitness whose account was recorded in an extremely obscure 1937 publication. And once again, Roberts' account is completely different than that of the Burns fantasy and is consistent with the historical record and lacking the absurdity of the claims depicted in the saga of Billy the Kid. Quote, "I don't know where Greathouse Ranch was. That has been a long time to recollect, that has. Me and a few of the boys set in to rustle a few cows and stray horses. We were wanted by the law, and they put out new warrants for us. We had to make a living, and rustling cattle was about all there was left for us, being wanted men. We got word that they were organizing a posse to come after us, and that the Murphy bunch had picked Carlisle to head up the posse and hunt us down. We was at the Greathouse Ranch when Carlisle and his men found us. They surrounded the house and yelled for us to come out and give ourselves up. I yelled back that we didn't want any trouble. Carlisle came up to the house to try to talk us into giving ourselves up without a fight. That has been a long time to recollect. But while we were there, we were surrounded by a posse. Surrounded by a posse we was. They sent in Carlisle to get us to surrender. He had no warrant. I just told him that it amounted to mob violence, and we didn't intend to be mobbed. Not just yet, anyhow. The posse had Greathouse with them. When they commenced shooting out there, Carlisle got scared and jumped through the window. As he went out through the window, they shot him down without warning. They thought it was me making an escape, but they got fooled that time. We were going to make Carlisle ride out with us after dark. They left, and we got out that night. The next day they came back and burned down the house, thinking that we were still inside. They were like rats. They burned us out of the McSween house, and they were trying the same thing again. But we beat them to it again, we did. We went to Las Vegas where I read that Billy the Kid had killed Carlisle. I wrote to Governor Wallace and told him that I did not kill Carlisle, that his own men killed him. But I got blamed for that killing too. Garrett told me about it later on." End quote. On December 12, 1880, Billy the Kid had a letter written to Governor Lew Wallace, during which he pleaded his innocence in regard to the killing of Carlisle. When Roberts was interviewed by William B. Morrison in 1949, only a few researchers were aware of the existence of the letter, which is housed at the William Henry Smith Memorial Library in Indianapolis, Indiana. This is confirmed in A Fitting Death for Billy the Kid by Ramon Adams, who wrote the following, quote, "The letter was hidden for many years in the private papers of Governor Wallace, and did not come to light until all of his papers were given to the Indiana Historical Library." End quote. With such limited knowledge of not only the letter's existence, but also its limited availability, how could Roberts have known about the letter unless he was responsible for it being written? The letter in its entirety reads, quote, "Dear Sir, I noticed in the Las Vegas Gazette a piece which stated that Billy the Kid, the name by which I am known in the country, was the captain of a band of outlaws who hold forth at Portales. There is no such organization in existence. so the gentleman must have drawn very heavily on his imagination. My business at the White Oaks the time I was waylaid and my horse killed was to see Judge Leonard, who has my case in hand. He had written to me to come up, that he thought he could get everything straightened up. I did not find him at the Oaks, and should have gone to Lincoln if I had met with no incident. After mine and Billy Wilson's horses were killed, we both made our way to a station 40 miles from the Oaks, kept by Mr. Greathouse. When I got up the next morning, the house was surrounded by an outfit led by one Carlyle, who came into the house and demanded a surrender. I asked for their papers and they had none, so I concluded that it amounted to nothing more than a mob, and told Carlyle that he would have to stay in the house and lead the way out that night. Soon after, a note was brought in stating that if Carlyle did not come out inside of 5 minutes, they would kill the station keeper, Greathouse, who had left the house and was with them. In a short time, a shot was fired on the outside, and Carlyle, thinking Greathouse was killed, jumped through the window, breaking the sash as he went, and was killed by his own party thinking it was me trying to make my escape. The party then withdrew. They returned the next day and burned the old man named Spencer's house and Greathouse's also. I made my way to this place afoot, and during my absence, Deputy Sheriff Garrett, acting under Chisholm's orders, went to Portales and found nothing. On his way back he went by Mr. Yerby's ranch and took a pair of mules of mine which I had left with Mr. Beaudry, who was in charge of Mr. Yerby's cattle. He, Garrett, claimed that they were stolen, and if they were not, he had a right to confiscate any outlaw's property. I had been at Sumner since I left Lincoln making my living gambling. The mules were bought by me, the truth which I can prove by best citizens around Sumner. J.S. Chisholm is the man who got me into trouble and was benefited thousands by it, and is now doing all he can against me. There is no doubt but that there is a great deal of stealing going on in the territory, and a great deal of the property is taken across the plains, as it is a good outlet. But so far as my being at the head of a band, there is nothing of it. In several instances, I have recovered stolen property where there was no chance to get an officer to do it. One instance for Hugo Sober, Post Office, Puerto de Luna. Another for Pablo Anaya, same place. If some impartial party were to investigate this matter, they would find it far different from the impression put out by Chisholm and his tools. Yours respect, William Bonney. End quote. According to author John Tuska in Billy the Kid: A Handbook, he lists 2 reasons for Billy being in the vicinity of White Oaks at the time. The first being that he was trying to find attorney Ira Leonard to discuss his legal troubles, and who wasn't in the area when Billy and his gang arrived. The second being to sell 4 stolen horses to Whiskey Jim Greathouse, which is why he was at Greathouse's ranch, a remote outpost some 40 miles north of White Oaks proper, when they were besieged by Carlyle's posse. This corroborates Robert's account that they were engaged in rustling horses leading up to their arrival at Greathouse's. In the saga of Billy the Kid, Walter Noble Burns has Billy and his gang leaving White Oaks, and on their way out of town, Billy, for no apparent reason, takes a shot at Deputy Sheriff Jim Woodland, who was standing on the main street as the Kid and his men were passing by. This resulted in Woodland and his deputies, J. N. Bell and Jim Carlyle, returning fire on the gang. Next, Billy and his men ride out to Greathouse's ranch, and this is the reason Burns gives for Carlyle raising a posse and taking chase. Whereas, according to author Robert Utley in Billy the Kid: A Short and Violent Life, the posse was raised to chase the horse thieves due to a theft of goods, and makes no mention of the purported assassination attempt on Woodland. Once surrounded, Burns has Greathouse offer himself up as a hostage so that Carlyle can go inside and negotiate with the Kid, setting a 2 o'clock deadline. That if Carlyle doesn't return outside by then, the posse will execute Greathouse. Carlyle then goes in to meet with Billy in an attempt to get him to surrender. Unlike Roberts and the W. H. Bonney letter, there is no question of a warrant or the legality of the siege by Billy. The Kid then offers Carlyle a drink, and the two strike up a cordial conversation until the Kid is angered when he notices a pair of his gloves that Carlyle had found while trailing Billy and his gang sticking out from under Carlyle's pocket. An extremely agitated Billy then begins to threaten and taunt Carlyle, repeatedly pulling out his gun and threatening to shoot him. During one of these fits, and after the 2 o'clock deadline had passed, one of the men outside fired a rifle into the air. Carlyle, fearing that Greathouse had been killed, panicked and, quote, made a sudden dive through a window, crashing through glass and framework. The kid jerked his revolver, and while Carlisle was in midair, sent a bullet through him. Badly wounded, Carlisle struck the ground on his hands and knees and began to crawl away. The kid's second shot stretched him out dead in the snow." End quote. Burns then has the posse open fire on the house, and a battle taking place for the better part of the day until the posse, tired and frostbitten from the cold, retreated for the night. About an hour after the posse dispersed, Burns has the kid and his men rush out of the house shooting at nothing like madmen and riding off into the night. I think even the most hardened supporter of the historical status quo will find it difficult to find any sense of resemblance between Burns' version and Roberts' account. Quote, "Garrett had been a deputy under Sheriff Kimbrell. Kimbrell run for re-election. Old John Chisholm, Leah, and several others put Garrett up against Kimbrell. They knew that Kimbrell was a friend of Governor Wallace and a friend of Billy the Kid. Garrett won the election. He had not been in the country long. He come here from Texas, where he killed a man, a partner, in a quarrel over dividing buffalo hides. We knew about it. We traveled through Texas too. Garrett had nothing when he landed in Fort Sumner. Me and my boys bought him his very first pair of boots he ever owned in this country. We paid for the celebration at his first wedding in Fort Sumner. He rode with us, gambled, and danced with us, but now he turned coat. He went to work for Maxwell when he landed in Fort Sumner, but he didn't last long. He bought in with Beaver Smith, who had a saloon and lunchroom in Fort Sumner. The people around there had no use for him. They were all our friends. With this killing of Carlisle tacked on me, Garrett had another excuse to go after me, which he did. We were riding to Fort Sumner in a snowstorm that December, about 8 o'clock. Garrett and his posse took over Beaudry's home and were waiting for us to come in. Folliard had been living with Beaudry and his wife there. As we rode in, I took another road, thinking they might be watching for us. Tom and the boys rode up to Beaudry's, and they started shooting at my boys, hitting Tom. I heard the shooting and rode in to find the boys leaving town. They carried Tom inside and let him die, begging for water to drink. His cousin, Kip McKinney, one of Garrett's posse, wouldn't give Tom a drink when he was dying. Tom was a better man than McKinney. Tom's uncle and the Texas Rangers did not let him down, but the brave McKinney did it. He did. I met Cook, Tom's uncle, in Roswell in the fall of '80. He wanted to talk to Tom, but I wouldn't let him. I told him Tom was my best pal and I needed him. I wouldn't let him go yet. Later on, I wished I had." End quote. In the saga of Billy the Kid, Burns has Pat Garrett, a buffalo hunter from the Texas Panhandle, arriving at Fort Sumner, broke from gambling and looking like a hobo, wearing battered clothes and buffalo hides for leggings. Burns makes no mention of Garrett's killing of Joe Briscoe, a fellow buffalo hunter who, according to Leon Metz in Pat Garrett, the Story of a Western Lawman, attacked Garrett with an axe after Garrett insulted him, stating, quote, "Briscoe took serious offense to Garrett's unwelcome comment and attacked him. Garrett was considerably larger than Briscoe and easily could beat him down. Briscoe reached for a nearby axe and charged Garrett with it. Garrett immediately drew his Colt and dispatched Briscoe to the afterlife." End quote. Unlike Burns, Roberts does reference this. According to Miguel Antonio Otero, a man who knew both Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid during his natural life, verified Roberts' account of Garrett working for Maxwell, being let go, and buying in with Beaver Smith, stating, quote, "Garrett had arrived in New Mexico early in February 1878, and he herded cattle for Pete Maxwell at Fort Sumner. Then Maxwell had discovered something which had caused him to discharge Garrett. The latter, who had saved some money during the few months he had worked for Maxwell, then opened a small restaurant, which he operated for a short time, finally buying an equal interest in Beaver Smith's store and saloon." End quote. Roberts mentioned that he and his boys were present at Garrett's first wedding in Fort Sumner. This is another win for Roberts, and it is not commonly known that before Garrett married Apolinaria Gutierrez in 1880, he was briefly married to Juanita Martinez in 1879, who died a short time later. Roberts claimed that he was present at the ceremony was confirmed into Hell on a Fast Horse, Billy the Kid, Pat Garrett, and the Epic Chase to Justice in the Old West by Mark Lee Gardner, who cites the account of Apolinaria, who attended the ceremony, and states, quote, "Among the folks at the Garrett wedding were some young men who during the last year had become regular fixtures around Fort Sumner. Garrett knew them because they were customers at his off-and-on saloon and store operations, and their informal leader went by the name of William H. Bonney, although most knew him as the Kid or Belito." End quote. Researchers and historians have long debated as to whether Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett were ever friends before Garrett became a lawman. According to Roberts, they were not only friends, but Garrett had himself engaged in rustling and gambling before, as Roberts described, turned coat. This is confirmed by Billy's friend and fellow regulator George Coe in his book Frontier Fighter, who stated, quote, "Pat Garrett and the Kid had been friends. In fact, it was an indisputable fact that they had been very close friends. They spoke the same language, were both rattling good sports, and experienced cowmen. Further, they were rivals at Monte, and good spenders at the bar." End quote. In the book, They Knew Billy the Kid by Robert Cadlick contains an interview with Lincoln County resident John Allred, who stated, quote, "Billy had been friends to Pat Garrett when he first came to Lincoln County, even furnishing the man with a horse." End quote. According to Fraser Hunt, in The Tragic Days of Billy the Kid, he discussed that after Pat bought in with Beaver Smith, Billy and Pat would gamble together, stating, quote, "Before long the Kid was spending most of his time at their place, dealing money whenever he could find customers. Some people thought he and Pat had a sort of loose partnership, and Pete Maxwell is reported as having said with a broad grin, 'They are carrying on the same line of business.'" End quote. Needless to say, none of this is mentioned by Burns. Robert's claim about Garrett rustling cattle was confirmed in the book The Real Billy the Kid by Miguel Antonio Otero, who claims that Garrett engaged in cattle rustling and interviews Susan McSween Barber, who echoes the same claim, stating, quote, "Billy often told me that Pat Garrett was a cattle rustler and had stolen many a herd of cattle from the Canadian while he was living at Fort Sumner. Pat Garrett was much overrated as to bravery. He was a coward at heart and only shot when he had the advantage, or as they used to say, had the drop on his opponent. It was said of Garrett that every man he ever killed was shot without warning, and I can well believe that was the case." End quote. Otero then interviews Billy's friend and former Lincoln County regulator Eno Salazar, who stated, quote, "Pat Garrett, who took up the pursuit of the Kid for them, was a cow thief himself, as everybody in Fort Sumner knew. He went back on Billy the Kid for money and for the promise of office. He was not the brave man many think he was." End quote. He then interviews another one of Billy's friends and former regulator Frank Coe, who states, quote, "Pat Garrett was an overrated man. He was a cow thief and everybody knew it. At Fort Sumner, he stole many bull teams and sold them to butchers at Las Vegas." End quote. Robert's statements regarding John Chisholm and Captain Joseph Lay's desire to see Pat Garrett elected sheriff of Lincoln County over Sheriff Kimball was confirmed in Billy the Kid, A Date with Destiny by Marianne Ballard and Carl Brehan, who wrote, quote, "Captain Leah, John Chisholm, and several large ranch owners had been putting pressure on Sheriff Kimball to appoint Pat Garrett as his deputy sheriff. What was not known until later was that they had a secret plan to run him against Kimball in the autumn elections." End quote. Burns fails to mention that prior to being elected sheriff of Lincoln County on November 7, 1880, that Garrett briefly served as a deputy under Kimball. This is verified by Leon Metz in Pat Garrett, The Story of a Western Lawman, who states, quote, "Although Pat's term of office did not officially begin until January 1, 1881, the incumbent, George Kimball, under pressure from the cattlemen, appointed him deputy for the months November and December 1880. End quote. Roberts correctly stated this little-known fact that has eluded many Billy the Kid and Lincoln County War researchers even to the present day. Once again, Burns failed to mention this. Burns then has Garrett receive word that the Kid and his men are headed to Fort Sumner and raises a posse of 15 men. They arrive at Fort Sumner and take up an ambush position inside the old abandoned Army hospital located on the edge of the village on the road leading in. Just before midnight, the men inside get word that 5 men are approaching on horseback and ready themselves. Once the riders get within 15 yards, Garrett shouts, "Throw up your hands." The man riding in front responded by whipping out a six-shooter, which resulted in Garrett shooting the man through the body near the heart. Garrett's posse opened fire on the remaining 4 riders, who wheeled their horses around and sped away into the darkness, under a rain of bullets. The man shot by Garrett remained sitting upright on his horse, who began to slowly walk towards the posse. When Garrett ordered the injured man to raise his hands immediately or be killed, the man responded by saying, "Don't shoot anymore, I'm as good as dead already." The man then lost consciousness, fell out of the saddle, and was caught by some of the posse men, who laid him down on the ground. It was Tom Folliard. A few moments later, Tom came to and began threatening and cursing the men, to which Barney Mason told him, "No use making a fuss, Tom. Be game. Take your medicine like a man." They took Folliard inside, where he laid and writhed in agony, periodically swearing and hurling insults. When the curses from the corner ceased, the dying man went into a spasm. His limbs twitched and straightened. He made a convulsive effort to sit up. "Goddamn Pat Garrett," he muttered, and fell back dead. End quote. Another hit for Roberts is his claim that Beaudry and his wife were living in the old building that Garrett and his posse had taken over and were lying in wait for the kid and his friends. This is confirmed in History of Billy the Kid by Charles Siringo, who was a member of Garrett's posse, who stated, quote, "Finding that the kid and party had been in Fort Sumner and made the old abandoned United States Hospital building, where lived Charlie Beaudry and his half-breed Mexican wife, their headquarters, Pat Garrett concluded to camp there. He figured that the Outlaws would return and visit Mrs. Charlie Beaudry, whose husband was one of the Outlaw band." End quote. In Pat Garrett by Richard O'Connor, the author states that after taking over the building, the men confined Beaudry's wife and mother-in-law, who were living in the structure, to a room in the building and placed them under guard so that they couldn't leave and warn the coming outlaws. Once again, Burns failed to mention this important but little-known fact, yet Roberts did. Roberts' mention of McKinney and Folliard's family connection is supported by Fraser Hunt in The Tragic Days of Billy the Kid, which recounts statements made by some of the posse men which details the events as Tom Folliard lay dying. Quote, "Jim East brought him some water, struggling for his breath. Tom begged that someone get word to tip McKinney, a family friend, to write his grandmother in Uvalde, Texas." End quote. Walter Noble Burns makes no mention of this incident. During an interview with William B. Morrison on December 6, 1949, Mrs. O.L. Shipman stated that her grandmother was Tom Folliard's step-grandmother. She said that Tom's uncle, Tallis Cook, who was a Texas Ranger, wrote Tom to leave the gang and come home. Billy reportedly intercepted the letter, sent Tom away, and arranged to talk with Cook himself. He refused to let Tom go, claiming him too valuable to him. Tom had a letter in his pocket addressed to his step-grandmother when he was killed. In it, he said he was planning to come back home. This same story was further verified by Jack Shipman in the January 1934 edition of Voice of the Mexican Border, Brief Career of Tom Folliard, Billy the Kid's partner. Once again, Roberts noted this event, whereas Burns made no mention of this incident in his book. Another win for Roberts and miss for Burns is the time during which Folliard was shot. Roberts has this happening about 8 o'clock in the evening, whereas Burns says it occurred around midnight. In the book The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid by Pat Garrett, Garrett himself supports not only Roberts' time, but also confirms Roberts' claim that it was snowing at the time of the shooting, as he states, quote, "Snow was falling on the ground, the fact of which increased the light outside. About 8 o'clock, the guard cautiously called from the door, 'Pat, someone is coming.' 'Get your guns, boys,' said I. 'No one but the men we want would be riding at this time of night.'" End quote. In the book The Capture of Billy the Kid by James Earl, it contains the account of Folliard's killing given by longtime Fort Sumner resident and historian Charles Four, who states, quote, "At about 8 o'clock, the Kid's gang was spotted by a lookout. Garrett's men positioned themselves, and when they were in range, Garrett shouted, 'Halt!' Folliard reached for his gun and drew the fire from Garrett and his men, while the rest of the Kid's gang fled into the darkness. Tom soon fell from his horse and died within the hour in the hospital building while in the custody of Garrett's posse." End quote. In his excellent biography of Billy Wilson, titled Wilson and the Kid, author Donald Lavash also gives the time of the shooting of Folliard as being around 8 o'clock. In the book The Tragic Days of Billy the Kid, author Fraser Hunt wonders why Folliard was riding in the lead position, which was usually occupied by Billy as they rode into Garrett's ambush, stating, quote, "It might have been the result of some premonition, some slim hunch of the kid's which could never be explained, some intuition that had to do with the primeval instincts of self-preservation. This was not the kid's night to be killed." End quote. Tom Folliard was ambushed in the dark during a snowstorm because he was riding in the position usually occupied by Billy the Kid. This would be the first time Garrett thought he killed the kid. It wouldn't be the last. This concludes part 2 of the Outlaw years. In part 3 I will discuss the killing of Charlie Beaudry, Billy's capture at Stinking Springs, and his trial at Mesilla. Until next time, stay tuned, and thank you for watching.